In this video, we're going to talk about how to pick out the input, output, and processing components of a problem statement. So this is the very first step when you're designing a program. It's part of defining the problem. When we have a problem statement, we have to pick out what elements we need to have as input, what elements we need to have as output, or what are we looking to get from the program, and then what processing happens in between. What are the things that the program needs to do? So the very first thing we can do here is to read over the problem statement, of course. So this one says a program is required to prompt a user to input the high and low temperatures for the day, calculate and display the average temperature, and display a message telling the user whether the average temperature was hot, cold, or moderate. And then the chart here will help us later, but kind of defines how those temperature ratings are defined. So to pick out the input and output, a lot of times it can help to just highlight these elements in different colors. So that's what I'm going to do here. But the first thing we want to look for is the nouns or the objects in the problem statement. This problem statement tells us that a program is required to prompt a user to input the high and low temperatures. This is what is going into the program. So the high and low temperatures would be our input. Next, we're looking for what we need to get out of the program. Ultimately, we need it to display the average temperature. So average temperature would be an output. And it also says to display a message telling the user whether the average temperature was hot, cold, or moderate. So a message would also be output that we need. So notice that each of these things are objects. They are not action words, they're just the objects that will go into the program and that will come out of the program. The last thing is to identify the processing steps. So this is where we look for specifically the action words, the verbs. What is the program doing? So reading over this first part again, a program is required to prompt a user to input the high and low temperatures. So the very first thing the program is going to do is prompt the user to get that input. So prompt would be one of our action words, one of the processing components. The next step is to calculate and display the average temperature. Now these are kind of two separate steps. So calculate is one action, one processing component, and display is another. In the last part, we have the same action word display, but it is a separate step, so we'll go ahead and highlight that as a processing component as well. Now when you're first doing this, it is very beneficial to outline this in a table. And you can pretty easily do this in Word. I went to Insert, Table, and then you can just select the number of spaces that you want. Okay, and then I'm going to make a column for input, a column for output, and a column for processing. Okay, now at this point, when you're doing assignments, I want you to go ahead and name any variables that you will be using for input or output. So let's review just briefly the rules about naming variables. So first of all, what is a variable? Well, a variable is like a container. It holds a value. This value could be a number. This value could be characters like letters. But the reason you have to name the variable is so that you can refer to where that value is stored by a name that makes sense, that refers to what you're storing. This also tells the computer this is where you need to store a certain value, and allows you to refer back to the variable name, and the computer then will know what the value is that's stored there. When you're naming a variable, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, and I'll write these here, the first thing is you can't have any spaces in a variable name. It has to be all one word together, no spaces. That doesn't mean you can't include two words in a variable name. So how would you do this? For example, if I were to go ahead and name one of my variables here, I know I need to get the high and low temperatures. Those need to be stored in two different variables. So let's go with the high temperature. I can't name it high temp with a space in between. That will not work. I could name it high temp like this, but especially if you have two or more words in a variable name, this could be confusing. So a couple of different ways you can separate the words is with an underscore, or by using what's called camel case, where you capitalize the second word in the phrase. Both of these methods help to distinguish the two words, but they don't have spaces, so it makes it easier for you to tell the difference between the two words, but still complies with that no space rule. Okay, so keeping those rules in mind, let's go ahead and name our input variables. So again, referring back to our problem statement, and I'm just going to highlight these so that you can easily see how the color coding helps. Okay, so our first variable is going to be high temp. Our second one is going to be low temp. And another thing with naming your variables, make sure you're specific enough. You want to be sure that when you read the variable name, you know exactly what it's talking about. In some of these problems, you don't have to be super specific because there aren't many variables. But in the real world, when you're dealing with many different variables in a program, you definitely want to be specific enough with your name. So stay away from things that are very vague and not specific, like variable 1, variable 2. That doesn't really tell you what the variable is storing. So in this case, we name it high temp and low temp. We know exactly what it's talking about. Our output, we are looking for the average temperature. So I'll go ahead and name that as a variable as well. And then the message, that won't be a variable, so I'll just put message in here as an output. Finally, our processing steps. At this point, you can use these words that you highlighted, the action words, to begin your phrase, but go ahead and describe, for example, what is the program prompting for? What is the program calculating? What is the program displaying? So the first thing is prompt for high temp and low temp. And I'm going to go ahead and use the variable names here where they apply. Calculate average temp, display average temp, and display message. So this kind of shows how you can go from the problem statement and highlighting those different components, organize it in a chart, and this will help in the next step, which is going to be writing the solution algorithm. So that will be in another video, and you'll see that organizing it this way really helps when it comes to then writing each step of the process that this program is going to go through.